Welcome to week one, hopefully the end of week one. So what I want to talk about today is wrapping up the chemistry, making sure we go over what you need to do and what you have hopefully done. So, a lot of resources were posted for chemistry. Many of you have done chemistry, so this is totally review. If you haven't done chemistry, that's why we are going through the whole thing, because as we talked about on the last video, biology depends on physics and chemistry, and so you have to understand the chemistry, otherwise none of the biology is going to work. So, you've got worksheet 1. It was in the lab packet. I've also posted it online. You are going to write out, hopefully you have been working on this as you go along, write out the answers to the questions in your own words. Do not copy paste. That's not going to help you. The idea is what I've given you with worksheet 1 is a list of the things that you need to know out of these chapters and the videos. So for example, I ask you to compare and contrast each set of terms or pair of terms. Remember, compare is how are they alike, and contrast is how are they different. So you're not just telling me what matter is, what energy is. What are the things that matter and energy have in common? Well, for example, they are both conserved. How are they different? Well, what is energy? What is matter? How are they different? So write out in your own words so that you understand that compare and contrast. What else you think to put in there for yourself, that's great. I'm asking you to do some drawings, to do some examples. So you're actually looking at 3 chapters to get all the chemistry. Chapter 2, Chapter 3, and part of Chapter 6 is all in week 1. It's all about chemistry. Okay, so if you've already done chemistry, this is a review. Chapter 6, we start getting into the energetics and the biological chemistry, but we're going to spend a lot of time there. So worksheet 1, you are going to turn it in. It's on the assignments. So you got worksheet 1, getting ready for worksheet 1, and as you're doing worksheet 1, some of your sources were an entire array of YouTube videos. Let's face it, Crash Course has done it all. He's done all the work. If Crash Course is a little frenetic for you, it's okay. There's another set. It's called Basic Chemistry for Biology Students. The link is there, and it's got parts 1 through 4. In Crash Course, if you go to Crash Course Biology, parts 1 through 3, it's basic chemistry and it gets into water. If you have already taken chemistry, or if you are in the Chem 161, 162, 163 series and you want to go a little further in depth in the chemistry, go to Crash Course Chemistry, and I've given you the list. There they go into much more detail. There's a lot more videos to look at because you're going into a lot more detail than here. This is just hitting the high points, but if you want to go deeper, that's great, go here. But when you're looking at using your book, using your worksheet as your guideline, these are the things that you need to know. And what we're going to do today, right now, is we're going to go over a little bit, and I'm going to wrap up and tie some things together. So, as I've said multiple times, biology depends upon the 2 big E's, energy and entropy. If you understand these 2 things, and they are real things, they're not just concepts, they are actual entities, they're at the core of how life works. There are a couple of things in science that we call laws. There are very few things, there's like 4. Everything else it's our model, it's our theory, it's how we think it works, but there's like 4 things we say, yep, this is it. Gravity. You know, there's no getting around gravity. It's a real thing, and gravity wins. Energy and entropy are in that category. We talk about rule number 1, or you want to call it the first law of thermodynamics: energy and matter cannot be created or destroyed. Rule number 2, or the second law of thermodynamics, says that entropy is always increasing. What that means is when you transfer energy, you can never transfer it all. Some of it is going to be degraded and unavailable. So these are our 2 rules to live by. Energy and entropy. They explain so much of what happens in life. It explains why you have to keep eating. You ate yesterday, but you have to keep doing it. Living things need a constant input of energy in order to maintain that order. Remember, one of the characteristics of living things is that we are ordered. We are ordered at the molecular level. We have order at the cell level. We're even organized at species level. We have species, we have groups. But in order to avoid entropy, we have to keep putting energy in. It takes work to stay organized. Think about your room. It would be really easy to have your room be a total mess. And to keep your room clean, you have to do work. You have to pick things up and put them away, throw things away. It's the same for anything. In order to have order, you need energy because everything goes downhill. Everything is going to chaos. And in order to avoid that chaos, that randomness, you have to have energy. So why do you need to eat every day? Because you are trying to avoid entropy. In order to stay organized, you need to put more energy in. So when we look at these two rules, that's how it works. One of the basic things you need to also take a look at are some of the basic chemical elements in the world. There are 92 naturally existing elements. If you look at the periodic tables today, there's more like 120. And one of the things that we'll look at the periodic table later, or if you look at it already, is how you can tell them apart. Of those 92 naturally occurring elements, living things really care about 20 to 40, again, depending upon what kind of a living organism you are. Most elements do not exist in their pure form in nature. I mean, think about it. We can mine for gold, we can mine for silver, but how do we get iron? There's no mine where you can just go get iron. It comes out of the ground as a compound. And why does it come out of the ground as a compound? Why doesn't it just come out as iron? Well, it goes back to energy and entropy. Lower energy level, more entropy is more stable. Everything goes downhill. So if we think about what's going on with rule number 2, so if we think about iron, the element, and think about it in your car or in anything. If you have a piece of iron and you leave it outside, is it going to stay as a piece of iron? No, it doesn't. What happens to it? It changes into that red stuff, that thing we call rust. When it's exposed to the air, and we get something called ferrous oxide. It's been oxidized. We're going to talk about oxidation and reduction a lot. So in chemistry, you've done redox, reduction and oxidation. Something got oxidized, something got reduced, but it has to do with electrons moving, but it also has to do with going to that more stable configuration. So if you think about your piece of iron that you left out in the rain or just exposed to the air for a while, it turns rusty because it combined with oxygen, because this compound is more stable than these two elements on their own. However, we also have to think about rule number 1 that says matter cannot be created or destroyed. I have 2 oxygen atoms here, but here I have only 1. I can't have an oxygen atom just disappear, so you put the 2 in front. So now I have 2 iron atoms. Okay, 2 iron atoms, 2 oxygen atoms, 2 iron atoms, 2 oxygen atoms. This is why we balance chemical equations. It's rule number 1. You can't have atoms or electrons just disappear or reappear. You have to account for all of them. When we start going into photosynthesis and cell respiration, how you actually get this energy, it's all about the electrons. The electrons are carrying the energy, and you have to account for each and every electron. Okay, so let's take a look at basic atomic structure and where those electrons and why we care about just the electrons. So if you think about this big thing in the middle, we call the nucleus. And cells have a nucleus too, it just means center thing. So we have this big thing with virtually all of the mass of our atom right here in the center. It's got the protons that have the positive charge, positive, the neutrons that have a 0 charge, neutral. They're about the same size. And then zip-zigging around out here in space are the electrons. They are not orbiting the nucleus. We draw this solar system model just because it's easy. That's not what they're doing. For one thing, it's 2-dimensional. Atoms are 3-dimensional. And the electrons are not orbiting the nucleus. They are doing all sorts of things out there around the nucleus. Some of them are actually doing figure eights, and some of them are doing dumbbell-shaped things. But they are basically in these areas that we call energy levels or shells. So the electrons don't like each other, right? They're all negatively charged. Negatives don't like negatives, but they like positives. So the electrons are trying, as much as an electron can try, to be as close to the nucleus as possible, while at the same time staying as far away from all the other electrons as possible. That means every once in a while they're going to run by each other, but as a general rule, they're going to be spread out. And there's going to be a stable configuration. So when we look at electron configuration, it's where are the electrons, how are they arranged around it, and there are certain configurations that are more stable than others. So in this particular one, I've given us element number 4. We've got 4 protons, 4 electrons, and the inner level, the inner shell, has 2 electrons. And the next one out here would actually like to have 8. There's something in biology called the octet rule. For virtually all of the atoms that we care about, they want to have 8 electrons in this outer energy level. We're ignoring the transition metals. You can't trust them. They're sneaky. They do all sorts of weird things. But if you think about carbon and nitrogen and all the rest of the ones that living things use all the time, you can think about 8 electrons in this outer energy level. That would be stable. So this particular atom would like to have some more electrons. How can it get more electrons? Could steal 6. That's a lot of electrons. Or how about just lose 2? So basically we think about what electrons can do. They can gain electrons, lose electrons, or share. And it has to do with going to that configuration, is how can I get to that point where this particular atom is going to have the optimal number of electrons and be stable. Because the electrons are always moving, 2 atoms can actually share electrons because they're going back and forth. It's kind of like having a cat. You have a cat. You come home from work. Cat comes in, has a bite to eat, takes a nap. In the morning, you let the cat out. The cat goes across the street, goes into the neighbor's house, has a bite to eat, takes a nap. You have a cat. They have a cat. The cat is happy and the cat is not telling. Electrons can do the same thing because they're moving. So they can share. They can be lost, gained, or shared. Which leads us to the next thing that they can do, which is form bonds. So, electrons, that's where all the action is. So if you think about, when we talk about quanta, anything, you've all heard about a quantum leap, and you think it's this gigantic leap. No, a quantum leap is a little tiny leap. Electrons are in these energy levels or shells, and they can move around and they can move up and down from the energy level to the next energy level. But in order to go from energy level 1 to energy level 2, they have to get exactly the right amount of energy, a quanta of energy. And so when they make that move from energy level 1 to energy level 2, that's the quantum leap, that quantum move, but it requires an exact amount of energy. But it takes energy to move up, but that also means that when it comes down, it can give off that energy. So if you think about what's going on inside of our cells, what's going on with plants, sunlight hits the plant. The energy is absorbed by an electron, which is bounced up to a higher energy level. That electron is then incorporated into, say, a glucose molecule. You ingest the glucose molecule, you break it apart, and you release that energy. You allow the electron to move down to the lower energy level, and we get the energy back out. So the energy in food is on the electrons. And it's there because of these energy levels and stability. What we want to look at right now is how are the different ways that elements and these atoms can interact. So here's our friend sodium. And Na is not an abbreviation for anything. It's a symbol. So when we talk about chemical elements, these are symbols. So if you write capital A, capital N, capital A, that doesn't mean sodium, that's something else. It has to be a capital N, lowercase a. It's actually short for natrium, which is Latin for sodium. So, sodium and chlorine. Sodium has 1 electron in that outer energy level. So 8 is the optimal number. Gaining 7 electrons is just not going to happen. It's just not physically possible. Chlorine, on the other hand, has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 electrons in its outer energy level. It wants 1 more. So if you were to bring a sodium atom and a chlorine atom next to each other, a miracle would occur. Actually, it's called a chemical reaction. This electron from the sodium atom would actually travel over to here and join up with the chlorine. So sodium, the atom, had a neutral charge. But now that it has 1 less electron, it's still got the same number of protons. It is now sodium, the ion. So chlorine, the element, occurs in nature, well, sort of. It's a gas, and it's yellow-greeny, and it's deadly, which is why, you read the bleach bottle, it says do not combine this chlorine bleach with any other chemical because you can make a gas that can rip your lungs out, literally. But when a chlorine atom gets that sodium electron, it becomes chloride, the ion, and these two guys like each other. So we've got a positive and a negative, and so it turns out that in nature, you get a sample of a substance, we call it salt. It's got half of it is sodium ions and half of it is chloride ions, and not only is it not toxic, it's necessary. So we have changed completely the characteristics of these two elements to a completely different thing, this compound. It is an ionic compound because this is an ionic bond. One of the things about ionic bonds is that it does not form molecules. There is no such thing as a salt molecule. If you go looking for salt, you will find it in crystals, which is made up of an array that's half sodium and half chloride ions. And when we put these guys in water, most of them will dissolve. Salt dissolves in water, which means that it actually separates into those two component ions. So what you've got are sodium ions and chloride ions swimming around through the water, and because they are charged, that substance can carry electricity. And we call substances that can dissolve in water and conduct electricity electrolytes. And we spend millions of dollars on electrolytes. They have almost their own aisle in the grocery store. So if you think about it, these are required. These are necessary. If you want a really interesting story, read the history of Gatorade. It was invented by the Florida football team. Actually, they went for help. They went to a biologist, a chemist, and a doctor. The football players are not doing well. They're out here practicing in the sun, and they keep fainting. And that was back in the days, this was in the early 70s, when they actually said that football players shouldn't drink water during practice because it'll give them cramps. So they were just passing out instead. But they went to the chemist, and the chemist said, well, hello, they're sweating. They're losing their electrolytes. So they made up this batch of chemicals in one of the buildings, and they mixed up salt and magnesium and all the things that are in Gatorade, as in Florida Gators. And they gave it to the football team, and they said, okay, that's great, except it tastes terrible. So one of the inventors was talking to his wife about it, and she said, well, dear, put sugar in it. Give them a little lemon flavor, a little sugar, it'll be fine. And Gatorade was born. And from that, you have this entire world of electrolytes, because, oh wait, it's a good idea. So electrolytes are things that conduct electricity. You're electrical. You think about you rely on, for our nervous system, it's an electrical system. It relies on sodium, potassium, and chloride as the negative ones. So ionic bonds, as a general rule, they dissolve in water, and most of them conduct electricity. Covalent bonds, that sharing thing. The cat goes across the street back and forth. What that means is that the electrons are being shared between two nuclei. They may or may not be shared equally. It's kind of like you give the 6-year-old the Hershey bar, and tell them to share it with their 2-year-old brother. Or if you have 6-year-old twins and you give them the Hershey bar, you're pretty sure they're going to share it equally. So they're sharing and then they're sharing. The thing is that covalent bonds form molecules. We are made out of molecules. We're going to spend a lot of time looking at the different molecules that make up living systems, but they are made by covalent bonds. And we have basic things. So this, for example, is a 3-dimensional model of water. The red one is oxygen and the 2 yellow ones are hydrogen. And you can see the thing with molecules is that they have a 3-dimensional shape. We draw them 2-dimensionally, we can even draw them straight, but you can see that water has a shape to it. What that means is that this oxygen in the middle is further to the right on the periodic table, so it has more attraction for the electrons. Also, it's bigger. It has more protons, therefore more attraction for the electrons, which means that the electrons are spending more time around the oxygen than they are around either hydrogen. And because of this shape, we have an asymmetrical molecule. There's going to be more electrons right here than right here. We end up with a molecule that is polar. The molecule itself is electrically neutral, but the electrons are not distributed equally. So if we were to draw that, we draw it's a lowercase Greek delta. It's a little funny, weird looking D and a negative, and a delta here and a delta here. So what this says is that this molecule right here at the oxygen is partially negative, and down here at each hydrogen, it's a little bit positive. And what that means then is if we have 2 water molecules, they're not going to be attracted this way, but they will definitely be attracted this way. So water is polar. Life on Earth depends on water. When Star Trek, when they go looking for planets, they're looking for class M planets, they have liquid water. And you think about water is very weird. This is a really small molecule, but at room temperature, it's a liquid. And it's because each one of these molecules is attached to each other. It has all sorts of characteristics that we call cohesion. It has to do with the fact that water is sticky. Each one of these guys is attracted to basically 4 other molecules. When you look at snowflakes and you see that hexagonal shape, it has to do with the fact that the molecules arrange themselves in those lovely, nice little patterns. So polar molecules are attracted to each other, and polar molecules are likely to dissolve in water. This is methane. It's carbon and 4 hydrogen, CH4. It's also known as natural gas. And if you look at this particular molecule and its shape, it's very symmetrical. What that means is that even though this bond between the hydrogen and the carbon is a polar bond, this molecule has the electrons distributed equally around it. This molecule is nonpolar. It doesn't dissolve in water. But if you were to look at the size, water molecule, methane molecule, they are about the same mass, same weight. Water freezes at 0 degrees Celsius. Methane freezes at about minus 300. At room temperature, this is a gas. At room temperature, this is a liquid. And it's because of the polarity. Nonpolar, polar. Nonpolar, polar. It's going to be really important in a sec. Here's a 3-dimensional model of our favorite molecule in the world. This is glucose. Everybody likes glucose. Let's face it, everybody likes sugar. And the thing about sugar is usually what we're looking at is this hexagon. So things that have this hexagonal shape or a pentagon fit in the receptors in our mouth and say, ooh, that's sweet, we like that. And it's probably, there's a very definite reason why virtually all animals like sugar, because it's a high energy source. In your biological trivia of mammals, there's only one group of mammals that does not have a definite sweet tooth. Some of you know. Cats. You know, dogs have a sweet tooth. We know all the others do, but cats are the only group that don't have a real sweet tooth. There are some cats who like sweet things, but as a group, cats do not have, for some reason, they just don't have that sweet tooth. Biological trivia. So, you see this hexagon shape, so that's what tells us it tastes sweet. But if you look at this guy, so here's a lot of oxygens and hydrogens. Polar region, polar, 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 and it's not a surprise, you already know. This dissolves in water because they're attracted to each other. So you can have a really big molecule, and it's glucose on the scale of molecules is not big. But if you look at compared to water, it's big, but because of a lot of polar regions, this guy will dissolve in water. We're going to divide biological molecules up into two groups. Dissolves in water, doesn't dissolve in water. In chemistry, there's a continuum. There's totally soluble in water to completely not soluble in water and everything in between. In biology, it's just two groups. We don't really care about the middle. Are you waterproof or not? And so we're going to have two big words for that, for things that are either dissolve in water or not dissolve in water. And the words are hydrophobic, water-fearing, and hydrophilic, water-loving. Nonpolar, polar. If you think about it, you are wet. Inside of you is a whole lot of water. At the cell level, you've got these little tiny bags of cells that's full of water, surrounded by water, but each cell is able to maintain its integrity. And that's because it has a membrane that is made up of hydrophobic molecules that keeps the water outside and the water inside. It's like your skin. You have skin that keeps your water inside and the other water outside. It has to do with the fact that we need these hydrophobic molecules for structure. But we need things to be hydrophilic because we have to be able to transport it through water. So life happens in water, but we need to compartmentalize it. So polar, nonpolar, hydrophobic, hydrophilic. Two kinds of bonds, ionic bonds, covalent bonds, and last but not least, hydrogen bonds. These two are really big. They're really strong. They're really important. They form compounds. Hydrogen bonds on that scale are extremely weak, but they're, again, really important. Back to the water. A hydrogen bond is a bond between a hydrogen that is partially charged on one molecule and something that's negatively charged on another molecule. So the link between this oxygen and this hydrogen is a hydrogen bond. So in water, we have hydrogen bonding. There could also be hydrogen bonding in large molecules like DNA. Our DNA has a very distinct spiral shape. You've all seen the spiral. Well, it's held together between the layers by hydrogen bonds. There's a lot of polarity going on. So hydrogen bonding is really important for water, but it's also very important for the three-dimensional shape of many of our biological molecules, like DNA and proteins. So 3 kinds of bonds: ionic, covalent, hydrogen. Okay, so wrapping up the chemistry. If you should have used the videos, the YouTube videos, I've also posted some PowerPoints where you need to look at the energy, entropy, the different kinds of compounds, the different kinds of bonding. One of the slides is giving you a list of chemical symbols that you need to know. For example, Ca is calcium, Fe is iron, K is potassium. Wait, K is potassium, it's because the P got used for phosphorus. So they're symbols. Remember, they're not abbreviations, they're symbols. There's about 15 that you need to know because those are the ones that are going to keep showing up, and I'm not going to have the names written out. You're just going to see the chemical symbols. You need to know about atomic structure. You need to know about how energy and entropy applies to all of this, the different kinds of bonds, and why we care.